Welcome to my channel. Today I have a whole bunch of tips for you inspired by markers. And the reason I did that is because these markers I used to build this kit, which was inspired by the Counterfeit Kit Club challenge, and I'll have links for reaching their information below. But this kit that I built was based around plain white paper, plain white string, lots of stamps, and markers. And the markers are all about adding color and texture instead of using other elements to do so. So before we get started, let me give you a couple of tips on how to set up your markers to use as watercolor paint. So first I'm going to create a palette just with this scrap piece of plastic packaging, and I put a sheet of cardstock inside. Or you could just use an acrylic stamp block, which a lot of people do. And then what you're going to do is just scribble ink onto your palette and add water. And now you've got some watercolor paint. Let's go ahead and dive into the projects. Here I will give you a quick look at them. Each one often has more than one tip on it, and I will give you a closer look as we get to those tips. Watercolor smooshing is a very popular technique right now, and it's very easy. Just take a malleable surface, I like clear plastic so that I can see through it, scribble some marker on there, add some water, and then just smoosh it onto your project. And you can do multiple layers, multiple colors, it's all up to you. And here's the watercolor smooshing in action. I just used it as a basic backdrop behind all of the other elements on this layout. Here I'm going to tone down the color of a white piece of paper using a brown marker and give it some aging. I'm just scribbling on my block and adding some water. If you add less water there at the top, you'll get a darker, streakier look. If you add more water, you'll get a more blended, aged look. And then you can also add spatters to projects by just flicking off the end. And instead of flicking outward, I flick straight down, and that gives good results. So this layout is back again. I did add extra spatters to this one, and on my journaling block, that was just a plain white piece of paper that I toned down with that distressed technique. And this layout has some spatters on it as well, and stay tuned. I will have other techniques to talk about on this page. Here we have watercolor glazing, and all that means is painting one color on top of another color. And because watercolor is translucent, you'll see some of the color from underneath through your project, and that adds layers and depths to projects. Now, I wanted to show you here how the marker directly is a very different color quality than using it as watercolor. And that's a nice thing about markers, is that you could get multiple looks. And we'll go ahead and zoom in on those letters so you can see that glazing quality up a bit closer. This next tip I call spotlight painting, and what that is basically taking an element and adding some emphasis to it with a kind of a messy splotch of color. And now you want to do this technique using a waterproof ink on your image. So your paint that you're splotching with will be water-based markers, but the image itself needs to be waterproof so that you don't get bleeding. And here you see I'm doing two different techniques, a fast splotch technique and a kind of a slower, more controlled technique. And then I use that technique on this part of this project. After I've added all of this background stamping, I come in and emphasize different areas of my background, and I'm actually creating my own pattern paper by using this technique. And it's a fun little one to add a messy painterly element to your projects. So here is that layout with this tip in action, and stay tuned because we're going to use this layout for the next tip as well. If we go back to the beginning of that last layout, you'll notice that I had painted some elements on there, so let's talk about that. First, I laid out my photos and where I wanted them to go, and I kind of marked the edges of my photos. And what I'm going to do is actually paint elements onto my layout. So I am painting matte elements to go behind my photos, and I am going to paint some banner elements that will hold my title and my journaling. And because of the translucent quality of watercolors, we're going to be able to see through some of these elements, and it's going to give an interesting effect that you can't quite get with paper that's almost vellum-like. So with those banners, it's not an entirely painted element. So I use the marker to first draw on my paper, And then I use a wet paintbrush to kind of purposefully bleed some of that color out to create this kind of see-through banner effect. And I will use this bleedable quality of watercolor markers in a couple other tips as well, so be sure to keep watching for those. While you're painting, why not go ahead and paint your own background pattern paper? And this is a slideshow style of this technique. I used washi tape to tape off sections of my pattern to create this plaid texture on my pattern paper. And I went ahead and saved that washi tape so that when I rotate my paper to do the crosshatch of the plaid, then I can just reuse that tape and not waste it all. And I used two different colors here, and the great thing about markers is when you buy a set of markers, you have lots and lots of color to work with. And as you can see, this technique also incorporates naturally that glazing techniques wherever the colors cross each other. And if you use your markers to add drawing as well, you've increased the use of your markers and the design of your pattern. And here is that plaid pattern paper that I created, going to good use on a layout about baking. For this next tip, we're going to create a simple ombre effect on some letters, and all I do is add a very small stroke directly to the paper with the marker at the bottom of my letters, and then I use a damp paintbrush to drag the color from the bottom up towards the top, and that creates an automatic ombre effect. Markers are great to ink your stamps with, so you don't need to own a whole bunch of different colors of expensive ink pads. And I use the side of my marker and just spread the ink across my stamp. And if you make a little mistake and miss a section, it's really easy just to ink up that tiny section and correct your mistake. So that's another nice thing about markers. Speaking of inking up just a part of your stamp, I have this phrase that I used as the second part of my title, and I wanted to just emphasize one word in that phrase, and the word is special. And markers are great for just stamping a small portion of a stamp onto your project. And here I'm stamping it repeatedly. So here are just a few other examples of the way I use stamps and my markers. I use stamps to create a border and some labels. I use stamps to create clouds in two different forms and labels to create a backdrop. And then I use the label stamp and my roller stamp in two different colors to create some journaling labels. Remember when I drew that banner and then used a wet paintbrush to bleed the color out? Well, we're going to combine that technique with this stamping technique where we're inking up our stamp image with two different colors, and that's the great thing about markers as opposed to ink pads, is that you can easily ink different sections of your image with multiple colors. And then once we stamp that image, we can use our wet paintbrush to bleed the color in to give you a richer depth to your design, and then you can create your own embellishments this way. So we're going to keep talking about that ink bleeding technique, and you can use this with your own hand-drawn shapes, so you can just draw straight on your paper with your marker and go ahead and bleed it out, or you can draw using other shapes, and we'll get to that in just a bit. For now, let's take a more detailed look at this flow painting technique. So here is a live look at this technique. I have a drawn shape there, which happens to be a hexagon, and I am wetting the entire inside of my shape before I take my wet paintbrush and touch the line of that shape. And once I touch the line of that shape, it's going to cause the ink to bleed, and wherever the paper's wet, the ink will flow into that paper. Now, if it's not flowing enough, like on regular cardstock, it won't. You can add more paint to it as long as it's wet. And if you're using watercolor paper, this technique is going to flow much more easily naturally. Of course, markers are great for drawing and doodling. I often draw a very doodly outline around the edges of my page, and markers are great for that. And then you can also doodle borders to your page to add an element that kind of ties your photo and your page together. Like here, I've mimicked the plate in the left-hand photo with the border going around the outside edge. And here, around the edges of each piece of paper, you can see that I just drew a line, and that actually gives kind of a drop shadow effect, so you can use your markers that way as well. In this layout, I have that doodle bordered. I also have the drop shadow border, and they're both in yellow. And I went beyond doodling, and I went ahead and drew some simple grass in this scene that I created with watercoloring and drawing. Definitely don't forget about writing with your markers. Now my brush lettering isn't that great, but I put it to use here to the best of my ability. Markers are great to use with stencils. I am using an unconventional stencil here. This was just a leftover piece from a board game that my husband handed to me, and I'm using it as a stencil. Now you did already see this shape when I used the bleed painting technique, but here I am using an actual stencil with a similar shape to it, just another hexagon, and I'm using it more as a traditional stencil with just drawing through it straight with the markers. But then I've gone beyond that, and I've used my watercolor paint to also paint through the stencil. The final result of combining these various stenciling techniques along with that kind of glaze technique gives me this bokeh effect that is really lovely. You can use your markers to draw straight on your photos. This won't work with all photos, but it will work with most of them. Here I'm just using my markers to draw a bold border around the edge of my photos to mimic a mat, and I just use a straight edge to help me with that. So you can see the boldness that border adds, and you didn't even have to use any other papers. And while I don't have any examples here, you could always just doodle straight on your photos or print your photos in black and white and even colorize them with markers. Next up, we're going to talk about that drippy rainbow that you've seen a couple times already. So I just scribbled the rainbow colors onto a sheet of cardstock, held it vertically, and gave it a couple of sprays with water. And once it dried, it kind of had a blended bleeding effect, but this will depend on the quality of your cardstock. You may end up seeing more streaks to it. Now, if you try this technique on some watercolor paper, you're going to get a very different result because watercolor paper is meant to move the color around. So if you're going to do this on watercolor paper, you're going to have to be more reserved with your water. So what I found worked the best is once you have your scribbles down, if you just give it a couple of taps at the top of your scribbles with clean wet paintbrush, you'll get drips. The last way to use markers with cardstock is just to paint your white cardstock a solid color that will coordinate with your project, and then you can use that cardstock to do whatever you want, like die cut it to be a title, or use just a solid piece of cardstock as a background mat to other elements. All right, moving away from the cardstock, we can also use the color from our markers to dye fibers. And what I found works best is if you wet your fiber with clean water first and then dunk it in your pool of colored water, that will give you some nice colored fiber results. And here you can see these fibers in action on this layout. I should mention that this will work best with natural fibers like cotton, and here I just use a plain white baker's twine from the kitchen department of your market. And I saved the most obvious tip for last. Just use your markers as markers to color. Here I have some plain cardstock stickers that are just outlines that I can color in. You could always use stamps to create your own images to color in, and even create them into stickers if you want to do it on sticker paper. I hope you found some of these tips helpful. If you did, please give it a like. It helps my channel grow. And if you want to see more of my videos, go ahead and subscribe. See you next time.